Now, with all due respect to my excellent and learned colleagues, Professors Bill Lucas and Louise Archer, who presented so far, I have to say I'm most excited about today's session. Our understanding of the developments in the human brain and how they impact learning and identity are relatively new, partly down to advances in MRI technology. Is it unreasonable to say that's because of the work of engineers and medical physicists? But of course, it's mainly down to the people who interpret that data that comes from those incredible machines. So today I'm delighted to introduce neuroscientist Professor Sarah-Jayne Blakemore, who will be speaking to us about teenage brains. Sarah-Jayne has a chair in psychology at the University of Cambridge and is leader of the Developmental Cognitive Neuroscience Group. Group's research focuses on brain development in human adolescence. She's published over 160 papers in scientific journals, has won several awards for her research, and is a fellow of the British Academy. She's also actively engaged in public engagement with science activities with the Royal Society, and has an interest in links between neuroscience and education. I'm going to do a gratuitous plug of her book now, Inventing Ourselves, The Secret Life of the Adolescent Brain. It was published in 2018 and won the Royal Society Science Book Prize for that year. If you've got teenage kids, it's an absolute must. I wave it in front of my daughter whenever she's being grumpy at me, and I say, I know why you're acting like this. Sarah-Jayne will be pleased to know I bought 2 copies. My original is in the office, so I've added a little extra to the meager royalties you get from your publisher. So I'd also like to recommend her other book, The Learning Brain, which she co-wrote with neuroscientist Uta Frith. Okay, enough from me. I'd like to hand over to Sarah-Jayne now, but just a quick reminder that at the end of the presentation, there'll be the usual Q&A session. So please do ask your Q&A, your questions through the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. Okay, without further ado, over to you, Sarah-Jayne.
Hi. Hopefully you can all hear me. Yes, good. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk and for that very kind introduction. I've given quite a few talks on Zoom in the last 2 months, but actually this is the first one with slides. And the slides that I'm controlling are not actually on my computer, they're on someone else's computer many miles away from me. So I hope it works. Well, it's an experiment. Okay, so I'm going to give a short talk, about 25 minutes, telling you a bit about my group's research on the adolescent brain, and particularly focusing on social development in adolescence and decision making. Okay, so the reason I first became interested in the adolescent brain is because I was, many years ago, decades ago, I was doing a PhD on schizophrenia, which is a psychiatric condition that starts in adolescence and is characterized by symptoms like hearing voices, they're called auditory hallucinations, and delusions, thinking that other people are out to get you, for example. I became interested in the fact that over my PhD and then my postdoc in France, testing hundreds of patients with schizophrenia in psychiatric wards, I became interested in the fact that whenever I asked anyone when they started experiencing their symptoms, there wasn't a single exception. Every patient said at some age between 18 and about 26. So I started to wonder, what is it about teenage brain development that is different in young people who go on to develop schizophrenia compared with brain development in teenagers who don't develop schizophrenia? At that point, that was in the early 2000s. To my surprise, when I looked in the scientific literature, there was virtually nothing known about teenage brain development in the human brain, let alone the brains of teenagers who go on to develop schizophrenia or other mental health problems. So at that point, in the early 2000s, I decided to change the focus of my own research, and I started to study the development of the human adolescent brain, and that's what I've been doing ever since. So it's not just schizophrenia. Most mental health problems first appear in adolescence. If you look at this graph, which should appear in a second, you'll see that for a variety of different psychological and psychiatric conditions, plotted against their average age range in years, most of these different conditions, which are on the y-axis, first appear during adolescence. Now, adolescence these days, it has lots of different definitions, but these days adolescence is normally defined as the period of life between puberty and adulthood, and you can think of it as equivalent to about age 10 to 24 years. So it goes on quite a long time. Now, there are really big cultural differences in societal expectations of this age group. In our culture, adolescents are allowed, even encouraged, to be in school, in full-time education, living at home throughout their teenage years and even into their 20s and possibly 30s. Whereas in other cultures, that's not the case at all. And adolescents are expected to, or even children are expected to, become financially independent, earn their own money as soon as they are capable of it, and to have babies as soon as they reach sexual maturity. Now, what's interesting though, is if you look at descriptions of adolescence across history, or if you study adolescence across cultures or across species, what you find is that despite different cultural expectations of this age group, adolescents across history and across cultures and even across species undergo this unique period of biological, psychological, and social development. So, for example, if you look across history at historical descriptions of this age group, you find striking similarities with the way they're described today. So, for example, more than 2,000 years ago, Socrates described youth. He wrote a lot about youth. This is just one small quote taken from a very long passage that he wrote about youth, saying they have bad manners, contempt for authority, they show disrespect for elders, and love chatter in the place of exercise. Most descriptions across history of this age group are pretty negative, just like they are today. That's an interesting and kind of worrying phenomenon, that we do tend to be quite stereotyping and negative towards this age group in a way that is not really acceptable towards other sectors of society. Aristotle as well wrote a lot about youth, saying things like they're passionate, irascible, apt to be carried away by their impulses. This is the age when people are most devoted to their friends, and that is a concept that I'm going to come back to throughout this talk. Now, not many studies have looked at adolescent development across cultures, at least experimentally with experimental tasks. But one study did that recently. This is a study by Larry Steinberg and his colleagues, where he studied adolescent behaviour across 11 very different cultures around the world. And what he found was that although there are some differences, what was most striking to me was the similarities in certain adolescent typical behaviours across cultures and in the shape of their development. So, for example, sensation seeking, that is defined as the desire to seek novelty and to take risks. So you can think of this as risk taking. And what you see here is the development of risk taking across age between 10 and 30 years. Plotted for 11 different countries. And what you can see is that on average, that's the thick line in the middle of the screen, the trajectory of risk-taking is similar across countries, and it increases during the teenage years. It is highest in the late teens, and then it decreases again during the 20s. So this idea that adolescents take more risks, show this heightened propensity for risk-taking, is supported by this data in 11 very different cultures. And in contrast, self-regulation, which is the ability to plan actions, plan behavior, and control your behavior and inhibit risk-taking, also shows a similar trajectory across cultures, but in contrast to sensation-seeking, self-regulation improves gradually across the teenage years and into the 20s, and then stabilizes into the 20s. So similarities in adolescent typical behavior across history and across culture. Okay, so risk-taking, as I've already mentioned, is one behaviour that is that scientists are very interested in studying in adolescents, because there is this heightened propensity to take risks in adolescence, and people worry about that. And that's because if you look at mortality causes, the causes of death across the lifespan, what you find is that particularly in Western cultures, the leading cause of mortality in people aged between 10 and 24 years is from accidents, mostly caused by risk-taking. And this isn't true at any other stage of life. This is partly because this age group are physically healthy, more healthy than any other age group, and they are not, so they're not dying so much from health-related causes. But it's also because we know that adolescents show this heightened propensity to take risks. Now, it's not quite as simple as that, because as you may be thinking already, well, not all adolescents take risks. There's huge variability in risk-taking across different adolescents. Some adolescents are very risk-averse, but also risk-taking is really important. It's not all negative. It can go wrong and result in accidents, but actually we learn a lot from taking risks. We learn by trial and error. We learn about uncertainty, and it's really important for exploring our environment and ultimately becoming independent adults. But also, risk-taking in adolescence is very much dependent on the context of the risk-taking and the decision-making. So we know that adolescents are much more likely to take risks when they're with their friends. That makes sense. If you think about the kinds of risks that we worry about adolescents taking, for example, smoking or experimenting with drugs or binge drinking or even dangerous driving, those are risks that adolescents are not particularly likely to take when they're on their own. They're much more likely to take those risks when they're with their friends. And there's a lot of evidence for this, both from lab-based research and also real-life data. And I'm going to show you a couple of those pieces of evidence now. So this is data from the American Automobile Association. This graph shows the percentage increase in the risk of a fatal accident when drivers under the age of 21 are driving their cars with passengers versus no passengers. So what you're seeing here is the increase in death risk versus with passengers versus no passengers. So what you can see is that with one passenger, that increases the chance of having a fatal accident by about 40%, and then the likelihood increases exponentially with each additional passenger in the car. And this has been taken into account by different countries in their policies around young people driving. So, for example, in Canada, there are new legislation such that young people are not allowed to take passengers in the car with them for 2 years after they've passed their driving test. And some insurance companies also now offer lower premiums for young drivers as long as they don't take passengers in the car with them. This increased risk-taking when passengers are in the car is also replicated in lab-based experiments. So this is an experiment by Larry Steinberg and his colleagues, which has been replicated many times now, where he asked participants to come into the lab and take part in a driving video game, like the one you can see on the screen. And they measure the number of risks people take. So, for example, the number of red lights they try to get through, and the number of subsequent crashes they have as a consequence. And what they find in these studies, what you can see here in this graph, is the number of crashes, so the number of risks people take when they're on their own doing this experiment, is very similar actually for adolescents aged 13 to 16, young adults aged 17 to 24, and adults 25 and over. So the first thing to notice from this data is that actually when adolescents are on their own, there's no evidence of increased risk-taking relative to adults. However, in a second condition, the researchers asked the participants to bring a couple of friends with them to the lab, and then they carried out the same driving game, and 2 friends standing behind them resulted in a significant increase in the number of risks taken by adolescents, in blue, the 13 to 16-year-olds, and in the young adults aged 17 to 24, and had no impact on risk-taking in adults 25 and over. So what this suggests is that really key element of risk-taking for adolescents and young adults is the social context, having friends with them. Now, it's not just adolescents who take more risks when they're with their friends. This has also been shown for mice, sort of. A study a few years ago showed that adolescent mice drink more alcohol when they're with other mice, and that's not the case for adult mice. So what you're seeing here on this graph is the amount of time that mice spend drinking alcohol when they're on their own. And what that shows is that adolescent and adult mice drink around the same amount of alcohol when they're on their own, but when they're put with their cage mates, adolescent mice drink significantly more than they did when they're on their own, whereas that has no effect on adult mice. So this suggests that adolescent typical behaviours like social effects on decision making are not unique to human adolescents. And in fact, it's not just this kind of experiment, but many studies have shown very striking similarities between adolescent typical behaviours across species. All species undergo a period of adolescence. In mice and rats, it happens to be about 35 days of their lives are in the adolescent state between puberty and becoming fully sexually mature adults. And in that period, they explore the environment more, they take more risks, they're more impulsive, and there are large changes in social behaviour. Okay, so in my lab, we're really interested in social influence on behaviour, and we look at this in many different ways. In fact, we look at it we look at social influence on risky behaviour and risk perception, as I'm going to tell you about now. We also look at it in positive context. So, for example, social influence on pro-social behaviour and generosity. And you see social influence across domains. It's not just in the context of risk-taking, but I'm going to give you an example of a study on social influence on risk perception. So this is a study led by my former postdoc, Dr. Lisa Knoll, where we asked people, 563 participants, half of whom were female, aged between 8 to 59 years. We asked them to take part in a very straightforward paradigm task, where we presented them with a scenario which was designed to be moderately risky. So, for example, crossing a street on a red light. Other examples were things like driving without a seatbelt or cycling without a helmet. And then we asked them, well, how risky do you rate this scenario? And then we tell them, oh, okay, all the teenagers who've taken part in this experiment so far, this is their average risk rating for that same scenario. And then in a different condition, we tell them this is the average risk rating from all the adults who've taken part in this experiment so far. Now, the important thing here is that although participants believed that these provided ratings came from teenagers or adults, in fact, that was just a cover story, and the ratings were randomly generated by the computer in both conditions. So then we ask participants to rate, again, all this information goes off the screen, we ask them to rate how risky they think the same scenario is. And what we're interested in is how much people's ratings change between time 1 and time 2 in the direction of the provided rating. In other words, how socially influenced are you in terms of your risk perception? And are you more influenced by adults than by teenagers? That was our hypothesis, that people would probably be more swayed by the risk ratings of adults than by teenagers. And I'm just going to show you that data now. So what you're going to see here is the difference between whether people were more influenced by adults or by teenagers. So the 5 groups on the bottom of the graph are the participants that we included in our study. So you see children, and their age is just above their name. So children aged 8 to 11, young adolescents aged 12 to 14, mid-adolescents aged 15 to 18, young adults 19 to 25, and adults 26 to 59 years. If you're more influenced by adults than by teenagers, as we predicted, the bar will be below the 0 line on this graph. And that's what we found for 3 age groups, the children and the 2 adult groups. The mid-adolescents showed no difference between the two. So they were equally influenced by adults and by teenagers in terms of their risk perception. And in contrast, young adolescents aged 12 to 14, their risk perception was influenced more by teenagers than by adults. So what this suggests is that young adolescents are more influenced by people their own age than by adults. And we replicated this in 2 different samples, the sample I just told you about, and another completely independent sample of 590 participants a couple of years later. So this effect seems to be quite robust, it's replicable. And I think it has potential implications in all sorts of areas, actually. I'm going to give you one example. So, what our study shows, and what we know from other studies as well, is that young people are really influenced by each other, perhaps more so than by adults. So what's interesting though, if you think about public health interventions, I'm going to tell you about an intervention that's focused on bullying and anti-bullying, but you can also think about interventions that we are bombarded with today around, for example, social distancing and staying at home because of COVID-19. All these public health adverts, including things like anti-smoking and anti-binge drinking and anti-drug taking, they focus on the health risks or the legal risks of those kinds of decisions. But actually, we know that that doesn't really have much impact on young people because they understand health risks, but what they really care about is the social norms and what their friends think. And that was supported by this study which looked at an anti-bullying intervention in 56 middle schools in the US. So middle schools contain students aged around 11 to 15. So half the schools were randomly assigned to 2 different interventions. One intervention was to continue their anti-bullying interventions as usual, led by teachers. And in the other half of the schools, the kind of experimental arm, the schools, in the schools, a select group of students was chosen. They were educated about the harmful effects of bullying and social exclusion. And they were then incentivized to run their own anti-bullying campaigns. So the students decided what to do. They could do debates or parties or wristband campaigns or poster campaigns. It was the students who led the anti-bullying campaigns after being educated about the harmful effects of bullying. And what this study showed was that student conflict and bullying was reduced by about 25% over 1 year in schools in which the intervention was led by students, compared with the control schools where the intervention was led by adults. And what was really interesting is the effect was strongest when the students who were leading the campaigns were the more highly connected students in the year group. In other words, they were the more kind of liked students, not the cool alpha sporty students, but the ones who are most highly connected. So in other words, some students have more influence on their peers than others. And we've just published a paper, which I don't cite on here because it's literally just come out today, but we just published a paper on this in the context of encouraging young people to socially distance and also to even stay at home if that's the rule, in the context of COVID, rather than lecturing them about the importance of doing that for health reasons and to protect other people particularly, maybe a more efficient way and a more effective way of encouraging young people to stay at home and to socially distance would be to empower them, to encourage each other, to lead their own campaigns and encourage each other to do so. Okay, so if we think about what this means in terms of decision making, well, our argument is that while we think of adolescents as highly risk taking, in fact, they're very risk averse when it comes to social risk. They avoid taking social risks. That is, they avoid the risks of being socially excluded. So for example, if a young person is offered a cigarette by all her friends when they're smoking, for her, what's the more risky decision? Saying yes to a cigarette when she knows the health risks and legal risks, or saying no and potentially ostracizing herself from her peer group? Well, we'd argue that the social risk of being ostracized weighs in more heavily to adolescent decision making than health and legal risks. So avoiding social risk might matter more to adolescents than avoiding other types of risk. Okay, I'm now going to change in the last few slides to the brain. Now, when I was an undergraduate 25 years ago, I was taught that the human brain stops developing in childhood. I know this because I remember my lectures, and also I kept my undergraduate textbooks, and that's what they say. This is an example where a textbook from 1995 is talking about myelination, which is a really important part of a really important neurodevelopmental mechanism. And it says that, as you can see, it says that it begins in embryonic life and etc. It continues for considerable periods of time into childhood in the case of humans. Now, what's interesting is that we now know that myelination in fact does not stop in childhood, but continues right throughout adolescence and even into the 20s and 30s in humans. And that we have discovered in the last 20-25 years due to the ability to scan the living human brain using MRI scanning. With MRI scans, we can measure the structure of the brain, for example, the amount of grey matter it contains and the amount of white matter it contains. I'll come back to that in a couple of slides' time. And we can also look at how brain activity changes, for example, across the lifespan using functional MRI, which essentially measures where blood is flowing to in the brain when you do a particular psychological task in the scanner. So we can look at how the structure and the function of the brain changes across the lifespan in the living human brain. And those studies, which have been now been going on for about 25 years and have produced a huge amount of data, have shown that unequivocally the human brain undergoes really substantial and protracted development right throughout childhood, but also throughout adolescence and into the 20s and even the 30s in some brain regions. I'm going to show you one example of that, and I'm choosing this example because it involves 4 different samples, 4 different groups of 4 different groups of participants. So this 4 different cohorts. This was led by Kate Mills, who was a PhD student in my group. She now runs her own lab at the University of Oregon, and Christian Tamlers, who's a collaborator from Oslo, and many, many other people were involved in this. It involved participants who were scanned as they grew up from 4 different places. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the next slide. Okay, from NIH in Pittsburgh in the USA, in Leiden in the Netherlands, and in Oslo in Norway. And altogether there were 391 participants. Each of them was scanned at least twice as they grew up throughout childhood and adolescence. So in total, there were 852 MRI scans in this analysis. Okay, so the first finding, and what you can see here is how remarkably similar the developmental trajectories are in all 4 different cohorts. So NIH, Pittsburgh, Oslo, and Leiden, they are represented by the different colour lines on the graph. In all 4 of these cohorts, completely independent cohorts, participants who live very far away and don't know each other, their brains are developing along this similar trajectory. This is what you're seeing here is cortical grey matter volume, that is the average grey matter across the whole of the cortex, the whole of the surface of the brain. It's highest in late childhood, and then it undergoes a very substantial decrease across adolescence and starts to stabilise in the 20s. So what this shows is that grey matter volume decreases by about 1.5% each year during the period of adolescence. I will come back to what that means when I've told you about white matter. So in contrast to grey matter, cerebral white matter, which you can see here, plotted against age and years, increases linearly across this age range. Again, very similar pattern of development in all 4 different cohorts. White matter increases by about 1% each year during the period of adolescence. So in other words, there were very, very substantial changes to both white matter and grey matter during the period adolescents and humans. And what does this mean? Why does grey matter decrease and white matter increase during adolescence? Particularly the grey matter decrease, people kind of worry about it. They think it looks like degeneration or atrophy. But in fact, there's no evidence that that's the case. It's much more likely to represent a really important neurodevelopmental process. Now, we don't actually know directly what underlies these changes in grey matter and white matter, because although MRI scans give us really beautiful images of the living human brain, they don't have the resolution to tell us anything about the brain at the level of the cell or the synapse. That will require further technological advances, which I think will happen over the next few decades, but we don't have it yet. So we can only make kind of educated guesses based on what we know from animal research and also from research on post-mortem human brain tissue. And from that kind of research, we know that 3 really important neurodevelopmental processes are happening across childhood and adolescence. The first 2 are myelination and axonal growth. So axons are the long fibers that attach to each neuron cell body and along which electrical impulses pass from neuron to neuron. And as they develop, starting from about the 2nd or 3rd trimester in the human brain, they grow in diameter, and that allows more signal to pass through them. And they also become myelinated. They become coated in a fatty substance called myelin, which appears white under the microscope. And in MRI scans, the parts of the brain that contain myelinated axons are called white matter. So white matter increases during adolescence, and this is probably due to the constant and continued myelination of axons and also axonal growth. Now, these are really important neurodevelopmental processes because they speed up the transmission of signals in the brain, and you can see that here. I'm just going to play that a couple of times, which means going back and forth. On the top, you see a cartoon of a myelinated axon, and you can see that the signal is traveling much quicker down it than the cartoon of the unmyelinated axon on the bottom. So myelination and also axonal growth speeds up transmission of electrical impulses in the brain. The third really important neurodevelopmental process that might underlie particularly grey matter decrease is synaptic pruning. So synapses are the connections between brain cells, and we know that they increase substantially during childhood, and that in fact the brain produces an excess number of synapses in childhood, and those excess synapses have to be eliminated. And this occurs during a process of synaptic pruning, in which synapses that are being used are strengthened, they're the ones that remain in the brain, and synapses that are not being used in a particular environment are the synapses that get pruned away. Synapses are found in the grey matter of the brain, and this synaptic pruning process by which synapses are eliminated, we know it goes on in some brain regions throughout adolescence and might contribute to some of the decrease in grey matter volume. But it's still a really important neurodevelopmental process because it fine-tunes the brain according to the environment it's in. So all of these processes, myelination, axonal growth, will lead to an increase in white matter and a concomitant decrease in grey matter as tissue becomes more white and less grey. And synaptic pruning will lead to a decrease in grey matter. So these changes that we see in MRI scans probably represent these really important neurodevelopmental mechanisms. They're also mechanisms of neuroplasticity. And there is a general consensus amongst scientists who work on adolescent brain development that the brain is particularly plastic and capable of change during adolescence. Finally, I want to just say that so far I've been talking about averages. And most of what we know about brain development and behavioural development in adolescence is based on averages. But of course, there's no such thing as an average teenager or an average teenage brain. And in fact, the individual differences are very, very vast. And you can see that here. These are data from the 4 cohort study that I mentioned, that I told you about a few minutes ago. I showed you the lines of best fit of in this case, grey matter volume change across age, but I didn't show you the raw data, which is what I'm showing you now. That's raw data from individual children and adolescents. And what you can see is that the individual variation is vast, both in terms of intercept and also slope. And what this, we don't really know why. We don't know what underlies these individual differences. Genetics or the environment that the young person is growing up in probably both contribute, but environment is, infinitely vast, and it would be very interesting to know, and people are starting to ask what different environments, how that impacts on brain development. We also don't know what the consequences are of these different developmental trajectories. For example, if the brain develops very steeply in early adolescence, does that, for example, make you more likely to develop a mental health problem like schizophrenia? That's one hypothesis, by the way, of the neurodevelopmental cause of schizophrenia. It's a hypothesis, it's got some evidence, but work is just really beginning in this area to look at individual differences. So, just to summarise, social risk avoidance is an important determinant of adolescent typical behaviour. The brain develops very substantially and in a protracted way throughout adolescence and even into early adulthood. And adolescence, as a consequence, may be a sensitive period of brain development, conferring both vulnerability, particularly to kind of dangerous risk-taking and to mental health problems, but also a period of opportunity where the brain is particularly plastic, capable of learning and creativity. So thank you for listening. I also wanted to thank my research group and my funding, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Sarah-Jayne. That was really fascinating, and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions. We have two already, and I just wanted to pick up. I love the quote from Socrates. It's great that 2,500 years ago they found teenagers to be grumpy, and they had the same view. And indeed, one of our questions did ask, has there been any work? Is there any paper that delves further into adult views and perceptions of adolescence and how this might impact on the behaviour of both the adults and the adolescents? I suppose particularly in relation to teaching, that's quite an important thing.
That is such a good question, and actually people who work with adolescents, they tend to just focus on the adolescents' behaviour and views, and less so on how the behaviour of adolescents is impacted by society. But there is research on some research on cross-cultural differences, and for example, one set of studies that might be relevant is from Adriana Galvan's group at UCLA in America. She studies Hispanic families in LA and compares them to non-Hispanic families in LA, and there she finds that adolescent behaviour is different actually in Hispanic youth compared with non-Hispanic youth in some ways. For example, they tend to be less influenced by, they're influenced by peers, but less so than non-Hispanic youth, and they're more influenced by their families. They spend a lot more time with their families, and families, adults, for example, have different attitudes towards their adolescents and don't tend to have such negative views about them. That's families, not teachers, and I don't know of any work comparing different teacher attitudes towards adolescents, but it's a brilliant idea.
Well, there you go, Bex. There's a PhD there waiting for you with Sarah-Jayne's lab. Just picking on that, because I was really interested in this whole discussion around risk, and I was just thinking about career decisions and subject choice decisions that young people make at the age of 16 to 18. And I was wondering whether these are somehow linked to that kind of notion of risk. So, having peer influence, there's a lack of young people taking up physical sciences, and they might, particularly girls, and actually, are they influenced by their peers more than by their parents, who can encourage them to go into particular career pathways or subject areas?
Yes, well, absolutely. I mean, I think In terms of peer influence on subjects, I mean, there is such social influence, isn't there, on what's kind of an acceptable subject to do. And I know research from the Institute of Physics, which you probably are aware of from a few years ago, showing that, indicating pretty convincingly, I think, that girls who are at all girls schools are less susceptible to gender stereotypes around taking subjects like physics and maths at A level, and tend to take them more, and because the gender stereotypes don't prevail so much in all girls schools. From my own experience, having been to an all girls school, that totally resonates with me. It wasn't until I left school that I became aware of this whole concept that the science was not a kind of female thing to do. It was when I was doing working in labs, in neuroscience labs in America during my gap year, that I first came up against these ideas that that wasn't something that was particularly normal for a woman to do. And I never heard about that stereotype at school. That was a long time ago, but you know, these gender stereotypes make a big difference in terms of what girls and boys are willing to, what subjects they're willing to take up.
So they need strong identities, effectively, to overcome that kind of feeling or perception of social risk.
Well, that's a really interesting question, and actually much broader than just subject choice. Why is it that some young people are not so susceptible? So again, individual differences. Why is it that some young people are not so susceptible to peer influence? And it's actually not very well understood, but we hypothesize, and it's something that some of my PhD students are currently working on, that yeah, your sense of self-identity and self-esteem might sort of protect you, if you like, against conforming to what your peers expect of you.
Great, it's really interesting. Right, I'm hogging the Q&A session, so I'm going to read out some of the questions. Mohammed Mahdi Motada asks, do you think encouraging children from a young age to volunteer could help them in shaping attitudes while growing up to adopt better behaviours, whatever better might be in this?
Yeah, it's a great idea, and in fact there's quite a lot known about that. And again, it goes back to social influence. So if someone's friends are volunteering, they are more likely to volunteer, and they're more likely to have positive attitudes to volunteering if their friends do it. So again, it's not a question of adults telling young people that they must volunteer. I mean, it might work for a bit, but I don't think it's going to make them kind of embrace volunteering. Whereas if their friends are doing it, then they're more likely to. So yeah.
Interesting. Does the speed of brain development, how does the speed of brain development in adolescence compare to that in early childhood? Are we seeing a faster?
No. Brain development, as we've known for decades, half a century or more, is most pronounced in early development. The speed at which a brain develops in utero and in the first few years of life is faster and more.
And is that volumetrically then?
Yes, and actually, well, in all ways, including volumetrically, but that's a really important example of a distinction. So volumetrically, the brain hugely increases in volume, right, and starts slowing kind of mid-childhood. And then actually the human brain becomes about adult volume by about age 8 or 9. So after age 8 or 9 years, the brain's overall volume doesn't change very much at all. Its internal composition changes very significantly, as I've been talking about, but its volume doesn't change. So the first few years of life is where you see the most dramatic changes, both in volume, which you don't see in adolescence, but also in the composition and the development of neurons and their structure.
And Muir MacDonald asks, are there differences? Have you seen any differences in male and female development?
This is a really good question, because anyone with children or who teaches children will think that, will know that girls and boys are just very different. And if you, for example, take risk taking in adolescence. Now, the mortality graphs. I wish I had a particular graph that I found on Twitter the other day to show you, but I'll try to describe it. So the mortality graphs showing that the leading cause of death in young people is caused by accidents. That's mostly in young men, and it's mostly things like car accidents. So in real life, there are gender differences in things like risk taking. The graph I wanted to show you the other day was a kind of depressing graph, as we're constantly bombarded with at the moment, about excess mortality over the last 2 months due to COVID or non-COVID related causes across the population, divided into age brackets. And what was interesting is that the number of deaths in the last 2 months in young men has decreased. And that's probably because of the staying at home rule. There's less, they're not going out and taking risks on the road or elsewhere. So anyway, coming back to gender differences, that wasn't the case for females. The deaths were about the same. Right. So there are gender differences in real life. However, in the lab, we don't find gender differences in our tasks or even in the brain development studies. And I think that's because our tasks are very, very specific and sensitive to tiny, tiny differences in behaviour. And when you get people doing those tasks at that kind of level where they're really focusing on the task, then it kind of washes out differences that you see at a population level. And that's the other thing, is that although there are gender differences at a population level, there's huge overlaps between the genders in every way. And so in order to be able to see the differences, you'd need huge numbers of right. participants in the experiment, and we work with much smaller numbers.
Okay. A really interesting question here from Jane Sutton, and I see this myself and my own teenage daughter. My teenage boys all like a lie-in, but my 19-year-old is an extreme owl who has struggled all through school and college to get up in the morning. Is this related to brain development and the changes that are happening?
Yes, it is. And there are individual differences. So not all teenagers will do this, but actually most will. I'm sure this will resonate with lots of parents, that when you go through puberty, your circadian rhythm changes so that melatonin, and that's the hormone that the brain produces in the evenings, which in humans makes us feel sleepy. After puberty, melatonin is produced a couple of hours later than either in childhood or after about mid-20s. What that means is that teenagers are less sleepy in the evening and they're not ready to go to sleep until later on at night. But it also means that they find it really hard to get up in the morning in time for school, because that's in the middle of their kind of biological night, because of this circadian rhythm shift. So there is a biological reason for that. There's also social reasons. It's not just biological. I mean, for example, if you think about in normal life, not so much now, but in normal life, teenagers are so busy at school. There is so much pressure on them. There's masses of homework. There's a pressure on them to do extracurricular activities after school. Then they have to have dinner, and et cetera, et cetera. And there's only a very short amount of kind of downtime, and that tends to be late at night when they're on their phones, texting their friends. And so socially, that kind of pushes them into a later night as well.
Right. There are instances of schools starting later, aren't there? I believe
There are a few schools in this country and also in the US. In the US, it's more of a problem because schools start even earlier than they start here. They often start around 7:30 or 8 a.m. in the morning in the US, and the distance to travel to the school is much longer. So this means that American children are often and young people are often having to get up really early to go to school. So there's been a big push from circadian rhythm researchers in the US to shift school start times to later, to be more in line with young people's natural circadian rhythm. In this country, a few schools have tried this. In my kind of anecdotal experience talking to teachers and pupils in those schools, the students love it. They think it's a great thing, even though, by the way, of course, they have to stay later at school. So it's not like their school day is narrowed. They do the same number of hours, but just later. But they're very positive about it. It's very difficult though, from a kind of social point of view, because society is oriented around when children at school, so that parents and teachers can go to work when their children are. So it's not something that's easy to change from a policy point of view.
John Fitzpatrick asks where we can get a copy of the paper that you've published today. We will get a link from you and we'll put it on the Academy website.
Yeah, please do. It's just come out.
Joe asks, the graph about self-regulation shows a fairly dramatic drop-off into adulthood. Is that being explored?
Self-regulation.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't a drop-off. It was self-regulation improved. So self-regulation, the ability to kind of control yourself.
Oh, that's right. Yes, yes.
It improves during the teenage years, which kind of makes sense if you know teenagers. They get better and better at regulating their own behaviour, controlling themselves, inhibiting inappropriate actions, and then that stabilizes in adulthood, and it doesn't change much after that.
So I had a question on that as well. I thought, would it be better to start higher education later if self-regulation happens at a later period in adolescent development?
That's a good question. I think, so one general thing to say about this is that I think understanding adolescent brain development and behavioural development does give us a kind of window into why some adolescents behave the way they do. And we know that the parts of their brain that are involved in planning and regulating behaviour and making decisions, for example, the prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex, are undergoing huge amounts of development that continues right into the 20s. And we also know that those kinds of behaviours are also gradually developing, gradually improving during the teenage years. So even though teenagers might look like adults and might be, taller than you, that doesn't mean that they have an adult brain or an adult capacity to plan and regulate their behaviours or regulate their emotions. So support is really, really crucial throughout the teenage years, just like it is during childhood. That's one thing to say about that. And then, the fact that these behaviours continue and brain regions continue to develop right into the 20s suggests that, well, firstly, things are still changing and developing even into early adulthood, and that people can change and that it's not too late. And I think one policy implication of this research is that we have a very kind of one-size-fits-all education system in this country, really. If you haven't done your GCSEs and your A-levels on time, if you haven't got into a university on time, it's very difficult to do anything about it. We don't encourage that as a society, but there's no reason why we shouldn't, given given how long the brain develops for.
On an anonymous question here, do the kind of mathematical skills or the kind of creative problem-solving skills of engineers take time to develop in adolescence? So do teenagers naturally have these mathematical skills, or do they actually take a while? Are we expecting too much from young teenagers to think of themselves as engineers and scientists of the future?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I was going to show some slides. You probably saw them whiz through at the end, some slides on that. So some really complex mathematical concepts which are related to nonverbal reasoning might be might be less easy for younger adolescents, for example, and children to grapple with than when they're in their late adolescence. So we did an experiment where it was a training study where we trained different age groups to do non-verbal reasoning tasks. These are tasks like the kind of matrix tasks where you see a pattern, a complicated pattern, and it's missing one element, and you have to choose out of a choice of 4 which is the missing element. And you can make these really hard. And what we found was that the ability to learn how to do nonverbal reasoning, so the training effect, was higher in late adolescence than it was in early or mid-adolescence, suggesting that it might be more efficient to wait until late adolescence to try to teach young people really complex skills like nonverbal reasoning. Nonverbal reasoning is highly related to lots of different complex maths. So yes, very possibly in answer to your question.
That might explain why I did so badly in my A-levels. We're running out of time, but there's a couple more I'd like to get through. With the continuing prevalence of social media and constant scrolling, is there any truth in the widely held belief that adolescents, especially today, have a smaller concentration span? Is there science to back this up?
Not really. There's no data. There's a lot of speculation and a lot of kind of worry, but there's actually very little evidence. That's because the data hasn't been collected, and so it's difficult to speculate. We know that the brain is very plastic. If you train it in one way, it'll get better in that aspect, in that skill. So maybe the hypothesis would be that the brains of young people who spend a lot of time scrolling online will be very good at kind of multitasking and short bursts of attention, but less good at sustained attention. But we just don't know that. Lots of research is now being done on the effects of social media on adolescent development and mental health. But so far, the data that is available is just very kind of correlational. We don't know what's cause and effect. We will know more about that, I should think, in the next 10 years.
And while we're in lockdown and young people are being isolated, we're in National Wellbeing Mental Health Week this week. I mean, is there any dangers of that excessive screen time in terms of mental health of adolescents?
It's a really interesting question. I have 2 teenagers upstairs, and they're spending more time on their screens, both
likewise
and socially than ever before. So we also wrote another paper about this that is available as a preprint now on the effects of social distancing on adolescent mental health and the potentially mitigating effects of social media. So the idea was that social interaction and social learning is critical in adolescence. That's what adolescence is all about, really, learning about the world and the people in it. And so if you deprive adolescents of face-to-face social interaction, that might be really detrimental for their development and their mental health. So there's a big concern about social distancing. However, one possibility is that because adolescents are so tuned in to social media, maybe interaction with friends virtually via social media might mitigate the potentially harmful effects of social distancing. And again, it's a kind of open question, but my view is that it's a question of risks and benefits, and the benefit of young people staying in touch with their friends and socially connecting with their friends probably outweighs the potential harms of staring at a screen a lot.
I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. There's lots of questions. We will try and get some answers to these with Sarah-Jayne and maybe post them on the website. But thank you once again, Sarah-Jayne, for a really just fascinating and stimulating talk. That's it from us for this week. Next week, we're taking a slightly different tack. We have Paul Shakespeare from the UK High Value Manufacturing Catapult. Sorry, my cat is jumping all over the table and distracting me. He'll be talking about a new framework that they've developed for mapping skills requirements against new technology developments. It's going to be a hugely important subject area for colleges and universities as the government's agenda to ramp up the research and innovation economy kicks in after we leave this lockdown period. So please do join us next week at the late time of 11 a.m. But that's it for now, and goodbye.